Hello, YouTube. I'm just here discussing various things about the internet and my various experiences on internet discussion forums. And I wanted to talk about a couple of things, a couple of words, a couple of ideas, a couple of concepts that get thrown around rather inaccurately and rather oddly on the internet discussions and in life in general. And I think people need to know and understand what they are and how they should actually be properly used. The one I want to talk about today is bias. Okay, bias. It's something that's thrown around a lot on internet discussions, in my experience. When people say, "Oh, that's source. That's bias source. You can't use that. It's biased. It's in favour of this, or that's bias. So you can't use that to prove it. You need to have an unbiased source to prove that." Do you see that all over the place? Sort of, this source is biased, that source is biased, that television channel is biased, that newspaper is biased. People throw the word bias around as if it's some sort of grenade. If you throw it at someone and it explodes on them, then suddenly, push, their argument's gone. It's like, you bang, their argument goes out the window. Firstly, I'd like to say that that's not what bias does to an argument, and secondly, I'd like to prove that just because something is biased does not make it useless. So that's what I intend to discuss with YouTube today. Now, the first thing that needs pointing out is that there are two distinct types of bias. Now, within one of those types, there are several other subsections, but we'll go into this a bit later. There's subjective and absolute bias. Subjective bias is where you have... okay, let's give you an example. The subjective bias is, let's say, if I were to say about my friend John, John is a really nice guy. John is great. He's lovely. He's wonderful. He's a good bloke, good all-round guy. Now, that's an example of subjective bias. The reason for that is, firstly, it's quite obvious I'm biased because I'm his friend. If I were to say about my friend John that he's a great guy, yes, of course I would say that he's my friend John. But the thing is, in saying that, I'm not actually really deviating from I'm not sort of deviating from what is expected of my what do you call it? The providence. I'm not deviating from the providence's expected position. It's not really bias in any important sense, because ultimately I'm not saying anything particularly important. I mean, not that John being nice isn't important, but in the sense that I'm not saying anything that couldn't be objectively verified. You can't objectively verify that John is nice, simply because A, the concept of niceness is subjective anyway, and B, what I consider nice, you might not consider nice, and there is a bias which is unimportant, really, because it's not realistic bias. I mean, to give a more concrete example, someone was to say that the best place in the world to live is South Africa. The best place in the world to live is Micronesia. The best place in the world to live is Djibouti. The best place in the world to live is Brazil, etc. Now, that's a subjective bias, because what is best for you might not be best for me, and vice versa. So you can't really, in those instances, say that kind of bias is important. It's subjective bias. It's like, sort of in historical articles, people read, King John was a wonderful king, or Richard III was a very nice king, that sort of thing. He was a great man. He was a good man. I mean, those are all subjective biases. I mean, people will say those things for any number of reasons, but it doesn't matter, because ultimately they're not saying anything factual. They don't disturb your search for the truth. And more importantly, just because they're biased in that way doesn't make them not useful, because in the historical sense of the word, you can then look and see who that person is who says that, and ask, well, why did they say that? I mean, why would that particular providence mean that they would say that? That's quite interesting, the sort of historical answer of that. The more important sort of bias, the more worrying one, is what we would call factual bias, or objective, absolute bias. Now that's where, if I were to say, take the example of John, John's a really nice guy. He gives £10 to charity every week. Now I've made a factual statement there. You spot it? The £10 a week. Now, There is where bias is important, because I'm his friend, and I may or may not have a reason to, being his friend, have a reason to glorify him in some fashion or other. And now, whether or not what I've said there is a factual statement, and to prove it's biased, prove that factual statement is biased, you would have to prove that what I said is somehow untrue. You'd have to prove that John doesn't give £10 a week to charity, or he doesn't give £10 a week, he gives in fact £5, or he gives not every week but every 2 weeks, etc. Somehow you'd have to, in order to prove that that statement's biased, you have to prove that what I've said is somehow wrong. Now, the fact of the matter is, this is where people get a lot of mistakes from about bias, because people often assume that if the source is, that the provenance of the source is going to be in favour of that person, then whatever factual statements they make is automatically wrong, or automatically suspect. Now, I agree that they're suspect, but to say that they're biased and say they're wrong is a step too far. You can't say, just because someone is a position is in favour of someone, if their factual statements are in favour, doesn't make them wrong. Okay, I'll give you an example. ExxonMobil, the petrol company group. Now, a few years back, ExxonMobil did a study. They did a study into climate change, and their results came up. They they didn't do the study, they financed it. But the financed work said, actually, climate change may not be as bad as we think it is. It may well be that actually this is just a natural progression and humans aren't causing that much to it. So that was their idea. Now, the thing about that is, a lot of people at the time said, ExxonMobil, this is a biased piece of research and is not valid because ExxonMobil is a petrol company and it is in their interests to keep on burning fossil fuels at the current rate. Now, that's true, and I don't know if the ExxonMobil group was exaggerating or lying or whatever, but the thing is, people can't say, just because the ExxonMobil group has an interest in saying that, that does not mean, therefore, that the ExxonMobil group's research is biased and is not worth anything. If you want to prove it's biased, if you want to prove that the bias is of importance, you have to go beyond merely saying, well, it's in their interest to say that, therefore they would say that, therefore it's biased, therefore it's wrong. You have to step back. It may be biased because it's in their interest to say it, but it doesn't make it wrong. It's not. You may have a subjective bias in the sense that you may expect them to say that, but to say it's factual bias, what you have to do is actually look at their facts and say, is that wrong? Is that exaggerated? Is there some kind of flaw in that? And it's that sort of bias that's more important. You have to, where there's a factual error, where the bias, where the provenance, because of its interests or because of whatever other reason, creates a factual error, a factual mistake. Something is intentionally wrong in order to make something look good or bad in their other person's interests. So, for instance, factual errors. Now, those are the sorts of bias that you can actually say, yes, that's wrong. You can't say it just because of the provenance. You can't say just because a source comes from this place, it's biased if it's facts. You can't say that because that doesn't prove anything. A source's location is not important ultimately to the factual truth of it. If you're looking for the factual truth, then you can't. A source's location should have no bearing on it whatsoever. If something can be proven objectively true, then the source's location is of no relevance, and people should realise that. People on internet discussion forums should realise that if something comes, like example, many Christians complain that things come from an evolutionist website that they're biased, or many evolutionists would claim it comes from a Christian website, it's biased. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter where it comes from. If it's a fact, if it states, for instance, as many creationist websites do, that a living snail has been examined and is found to be, by carbon dating, to be found to be 14,000 years old, then the only way you can prove that statement is biased and wrong is if you have to actually prove the fact is wrong. You can't say that's wrong because it's a creationist website. You have to actually prove it. Similarly, the American website contains an article. The American State Department website contains a detailed profile of Saudi Arabia, and it says this various religious freedoms and things that it breaches. A lot of people say that that's because it says that because America doesn't like Islamic states, doesn't like Islamic countries, and therefore it would say that. But you can't say that. You have to prove, if you want to prove that the Americans are being biased, you have to prove that they are factually wrong. You can't just say, just because the Americans are saying it, ergo it's biased, ergo it's wrong. You have to prove somewhere the fact is wrong. Bias alone is not come from providence. If something is factually true, it doesn't matter who says it, it's still true. As Winston Churchill pointed out, the truth exists, lies are made. The truth exists and doesn't matter who says it. So I think people need to stop throwing the word bias around quite so liberally. Thank you.